talk about what you might call post-traumatic stress syndrome, because you had the wrongs that were done during the Liberation War. You had the wrongs that were done during Gukurahundi, the emergency from 82 to 87, when many Ndebele were murdered and other people were murdered, and you have the wrongs that have been done since. And there has been no accounting for any of this. And in my work at the United Nations, I formed the strong view that there was an issue which you might call unfinished business, that unless there is some form of accounting and reconciliation, real reconciliation, that this will fester on more or less indefinitely. Now, what I know about Petina is that she's a citizen of the world now. She's a Zimbabwean from Harare, but she has degrees from all over the place. We poor chaps in the Foreign Office always feel rather underqualified when we meet people like Petina, because in the Foreign Office you got a first degree and that was it. And we were pretty distrustful of people wanting to join the Foreign Office with masters, let alone doctorates, and Petina has all three. I think one from the University of Zimbabwe, a law degree from Cambridge, and a doctorate from a university in Austria. In Vienna, was it?
Graz.
Very good. Well, as you can see, I can't compete with that, wouldn't want to, but it means that she's a Zimbabwean, but she has a perspective which is wider than just Zimbabwe. Can we start with the transition? Your views on what you think might, what form it might take, who might be the winner? Has Grace got a chance? We've been talking about women's rights, but I talked to an opposition ex-minister, not you, David, when I was in Zimbabwe in April, and he said he believed that he personally had more chance of bearing a child than Grace had of becoming the next president. Was that over optimistic or over pessimistic in terms of women's rights?
You know, I think David should kick this off, because I have a completely different perspective from any person that I've met and talked to. So I'm very keen to hear what David has to say about this.
Well, you know, we'll use every opportunity to plug the book, and in the final chapter of my book, I speak about this, and I say that Grace's power, Grace being Robert Mugabe's wife, operates in inverse proportion to Mugabe's declining health. In other words, as Mugabe becomes more and more reliant on her, so her power grows. But the moment Mugabe dies, I think her power will evaporate overnight.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm so glad you say that, because so many people are actually touting Grace as a real contender. She really isn't. She's a contender in the sense that she's being used by one of the factions. Basically, the first person who's going to know what happens to the president if he dies, and there's no assumption about that, he may live forever, but if he dies, the first person who will know is his wife. So the person who gets that news is in a really strong position to manipulate the Politburo, which is the main decision-making organ in the party. So that's why Grace matters. Grace matters because she is the person who is going to tell one of the two sides that this awful thing has happened. Now, the party is driven, as Sir Kieran said, it's split into, at the moment, two groups. One is led by the vice president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, and the other, surprisingly, is led by the younger members of ZANU-PF. They call themselves, or they're called the G40, Generation 40. They're all young men in their 40s, 50s at the very latest. Now, what they don't have is what are called liberation struggle credentials. They don't have any history as having fought the war against the whites, against the white settler regime. So the only thing they have is the power of crowd control. So all these protests that you see, rather not the protests, but the crowds coming out in support of Mugabe, they are all G40 organized because they don't have anything else. They don't have a constituency. They don't have the liberation struggle history. All they have is their power to command crowds. And that's what's so dangerous about that particular group. Because if that particular group takes over, we are going to see Zimbabwe become as populist as Hitler's Germany and Italy's Mussolini were through the power of crowds. And it's very easy to command crowds. We've got 89% formal unemployment. There are a lot of unemployed young men who all they have to do is to be promised a bottle of beer, a little bit of food, and they will take to the streets. That's the most dangerous aspect for me, this G40, David, that if they take over, then I think we are really in trouble. But at the same time, the other guys, Mnangagwa, the vice president, the war veterans, they are just as scary in a different way.
But it's also, isn't it, a question of who controls the intelligence apparatus? I mean, to whom is the head of intelligence loyal? To whom is the head of the army loyal? To whom is the head of the police loyal? And I got the impression, we were there, it's several months ago now, but that Mnangagwa had more of those sewn up than anyone other, maybe than Joyce Mujuru, who isn't even a member of ZANU-PF.
Well, that's the great danger. 2 decades ago, Judith Todd, Garfield Todd's daughter, joked in response to a threat that there'd be a civil war. She said, if there's going to be a civil war in the country, it's going to be a very short one, because all the arms were in this homogenous unit, ZANU-PF, against an unarmed civil population. So it would have been a short civil war. The real danger in Zimbabwe now is that, as Petina says, Robert Mugabe's party is split as we've never seen it split before. And it's not just split within the political realm, but within the military, within the intelligence services. And you've got a 3-way divide now. You've got Joyce Mujuru, the former vice president, the wife of the liberation commander of ZANU during the war, or rather the widow, who was murdered. Her husband was murdered. And there are people within the military who owe their allegiance to her. Then you've got Emmerson Mnangagwa, the vice president, who probably commands majority support within the military at present. And then you've got Grace and this G40 group, who also have some element of support within the military and security sector. But it means that we, in some respects, are at the most dangerous point in our history since independence. And the real danger is that there's going to be a bloodletting amongst these divergent groups within ZANU-PF.
Where would you put the chances, the two of you? I mean, peaceful transition, violent transition, 50-50, 60-40, 70-30, or what?
Look, I mean, I don't think, I'm optimistic, so I don't think it's going to be a violent transition. I think there's going to be some violence, yes, but I don't think we're facing civil war. I really don't. I agree with you, David, that the danger is there. But I think one of the things that's unaccounted for is the external factors that might have an impact, like all these demonstrations and riots that we're seeing. We don't know what ultimate impact they're going to have on the different factions. Are they going to make ZANU-PF unite? Are they going to split it even further? So there are all sorts of unknown factors, the unknown knowns, as I think Rumsfeld would call them, that may have an impact on whether we actually go into all-out civil war or not. But for me, the most interesting aspect of all of this is how completely inept the vice president has been in fighting Mnangagwa, in defending his turf. I mean, he has been completely clueless, and he's been outplayed strategically by the younger guys, because they have a lot of smart strategists. They might not have the history of the party with them, but they have a lot of really smart people who are outmaneuvering him at almost every turn. So I think, to me, the ultimate question of who is going to control ZANU-PF is going to come down to those two, either the G40 faction or the vice president's faction. But I'm not discounting that there may be other factors that could actually upset the whole thing.
Just to chip in quickly, I agree with Petina. I think that there's little chance of a civil war, engulfing the entire country. I think the real danger is this battle within ZANU-PF. The contestation will be there. But having said that, this week, if you've been following the Zimbabwe story, there have been burnings and protests in Harare, and it's a powder keg at present. And no one knows how that's going to unfold.
You're a Bulawayo boy, so I need to ask you, is Mnangagwa acceptable to the Ndebele? Is he acceptable in Matabele land? Again, maybe I don't know how much the audience knows of Zimbabwe, but he was the Minister of National Security during this terrible Gukurahundi campaign when there was massive repression of Ndebele, and he has never said sorry.
In a word, no.
So what happens if he wins then? You've got a
well,
whole chunk of the country alienated.
That's the real danger about Mnangagwa gaining the ascendancy, because he, in my view, he can only govern effectively through coercion. He cannot govern with the will of the people.
Yeah, I want to pick you up on that, because I actually think that the best outcome because the G40 scare me, I won't lie to you. They scare the hell out of me, because they are so organized, they are so ruthless, and as I said before, they're willing to use the power of the crowd. I actually think the best scenario for Zimbabwe would be if Mnangagwa takes over within the framework that Sir Kieran has outlined. You know, if Mugabe dies, long may he live. If Mugabe dies, Mnangagwa takes over, right? And then we have to go to an election in 2022 or whatever. And then Mnangagwa is defeated, 2018. Then Mnangagwa is defeated, because Mnangagwa cannot win an election, as you say, and he cannot rule without coercion. Now, do you really think, David, that SADC, the AU, the UN, will allow Mnangagwa to steal an election in the way that they allowed Mugabe to steal an election? I don't think so. He doesn't have the charisma or the pulling power, frankly, of Mugabe. So I think the best outcome could be that he takes over within ZANU-PF. Then we meet him at the election. And then, as you say, he's completely unacceptable in Matabeleland. He's completely unacceptable in huge, huge parts of Mashonaland. How many elections has he lost? And how many times has he had to be rescued? So I think the best outcome would be he takes over within ZANU-PF, and then we go to an election and Mnangagwa loses. That's the optimistic scenario.
I want to tell you a little anecdote tied to the book, but it illustrates the lack of support that Mnangagwa has. In the book, I've quoted extensively the statements made by Emmerson Mnangagwa way back in 1983, when he was involved in this crime against humanity, this genocide, and used inflammatory language. But when I wrote the book, what I wrote was what I termed fourth generation writing. The third generation was a human rights report produced in the 1990s. The second generation was the writing of Terence Ranger, an Oxford Don. But I'd never seen the original source, which was in the government-controlled newspapers. The book was published in March, and Emmerson Mnangagwa came out with a statement saying that what I'd written about what he'd said was false and mischievous, and that he was going to take unspecified action against me. That was released on a Tuesday night, and of course, you'll understand my anxiety. Because I'd never seen the original source, I was relying on what other people had written. So I went to sleep somewhat nervously, but the next morning, I woke up and went to Twitter, and the editor of the government-controlled paper, which had access to the source material, went down to his archives, photographed it, and put it on Twitter. Instantly, annihilating any option that Mnangagwa had to challenge me. But it does illustrate, even within government circles, he's disliked.
Now, David has dropped several very elegant, very moderate, but I would say unmistakable hints that we should be talking about his book a bit.
He finally got it.
I got it first time, but I thought there were one or two other things to talk about first, and we still need to talk about post-traumatic stress syndrome. I would say I read this book page to page on the Costa Brava two weeks ago, when we were ourselves in exile, driven from our home by our own children, who would rather have house guests than us. And first of all, I like there's still a sense of humor in Zimbabwe. David's had to put up with a lot, but the title of his book is The Struggle Continues. And again, those of you who are familiar with Zimbabwe will know that during the Chimurenga, the armed struggle, their motto was taken from Portuguese, from what happened in Mozambique, and it was A luta continua, the struggle continues. So David has now told me, when I reminded him of that, he said he's going to write another book, which is the second part of the saying, which is A vittoria è certa. Victory is certain. But you may have to wait a little while. It is a long book. It's a detailed book. But for anybody interested in Zimbabwe, I think it is an indispensable resource. Did you keep detailed notes all the time? Because you seem to have an extremely precise recollection of what has happened at every step along the way. And the other thing I was quite struck by was the number of times when you came quite close to death, either because people fiddled with the car, or armed men were following you, or wherever. I mean, I think those are two of the things that most struck me on it. So, did you keep detailed papers throughout the period?
Those of you who listened to Peter's talk on Silk Road yesterday afternoon, he spoke about how the genesis of his book was way back at university, and I wanted to write a book about my war experiences way back in the early 1980s, and I wrote an outline then. And because I wanted to write that book, I was pretty meticulous in keeping the records. So in the early 1980s, I represented as defense counsel many people who were the victims of the Gukurahundi, of the genocide. And whenever I had a very interesting case, I put it to one side and kept it. And at key moments, I didn't keep a detailed journal, but for example, when I met Nelson Mandela, I went straight home to my hotel room and spent 2 hours recording meticulously, every last word. So I had that record when it came to writing the book.
Are you a very obstinate and difficult person? I mean, in the sense, I'm only asking because you have to be pretty obstinate to carry on doing what you're doing when you could have lived a comfortable life as a lawyer in lovely Bulawayo, and not have your car sabotaged and nuts unscrewed and be followed and harassed and charged, and spend a lot of time waiting for trials that either never happened or were strung out for forever. So is that a fair description?
Yeah, my wife would certainly agree with you that I'm an obstinate person. I'm sure it's my Scottish roots. I have that dour side to me.
Oh, remind us, was it the Deputy Provost of
my grandfather of Edinburgh, and my father was born in Leith.
And are you Remain? Are you separate? Are you independents or?
I value my health, so I will decline to comment on that.
Right. Anyway, it's an extremely good book. A rather different book is the Book of Memory, which I've started to read. I haven't finished it yet, but it's absolutely fascinating. I was saying to Petina earlier that our family has a certain connection with Chikurubi Prison, where the heroine is on death row. I better not ask you whether this comes from personal experience.
Well, this is a bit awkward because I'm actually not really meant to be talking about the Book of Memory. I thought this session was all about David Coltart, so I had come with a list of questions to grill him. I'm in a very awkward stage because I finished publicizing the Book of Memory. We're waiting for the next book to come out in a month or so's time. It's called Rotten Row. So, and I've spoken about this book at 36 festivals, and I'm actually quite sick of the book, to be honest. I'm quite sick of the whole Chikurubi story. But so if I may, I want to go back to something you said earlier, Sir Kieran, and also what David said just now when he mentioned the Scottish roots. You talked about the unfinished business of Gukurahundi, the liberation struggle, and the recent events. But there's another... exactly. There's another unfinished business, which is the crime of colonialism. And in Zimbabwe, it takes a very peculiar form, because we should be angry with Britain, right? But we're not angry with Britain, because Britain, at one point, decided they wanted to get rid of the African colonies. They were too expensive to run and all the rest of it. So Ian Smith and his band of merry men decided to take over the country and declared UDI. So our anger now is with the descendants, if you like, of Smith, the white people, the white Zimbabweans who are in Zimbabwe. And so now they have been the bulwark against the British Empire. So our anger has been directed at the white minority. And the crime of colonialism is a real crime, right? We can talk about reparations if reparations need to be paid, but I think it's really, really important, as we acknowledge all the crimes of Zimbabwe, we also acknowledge that initial crime of people coming to take land that wasn't theirs, grazing over burial grounds, planting fields across, cemeteries. And I worry, David, that there's and what I loved about your book, and this is the reason I gave it a blurb on the front cover, there's a searing honesty in the way you confront that past. And it's a searing honesty that's not often felt in the what I call the white tribe of Zimbabwe, that somehow we seem to want to glaze over the war, we want to glaze over colonialism, we want to glaze over Chimoyo and Nyazonya, all the pain that has led to horrible things like the land invasions. But I think the chief value of your book, and the reason I'm so grateful for it, the reason I'm so grateful you wrote it, is this is a way to start talking in a very honest way about all those horrible things that have happened in our past. And so I imagine it must have been very difficult for you to write, the section in which you explained your own role in colonial Rhodesia.
It was very difficult. The first 7 chapters deal with that role. And when I produced the first draft, I gave it to a very dear black Zimbabwean friend who himself is an ex-war veteran, a detainee of the Smith regime. And when I wrote that first draft, I wrote as objectively as I could without too much reflection. And he was seriously disturbed by it when he read that first draft. And he said to me, whilst I understand you were trying to be objective, I don't know that you're the person I thought you were. And he encouraged me to be more reflective in those first 7 chapters to illustrate that whilst I did certain things then and thought a certain way, I no longer think that, but it was important to say that. And even after I revised it, following his comments, he encouraged me to write almost a warning in the introduction. And it's a bit like, on Sky Television, before they show flash photography, they warn you, and that's the warning that I put in the introduction, to say, especially to black Zimbabweans, you're going to find the first 7 chapters very difficult, very hard to read, because white Rhodesians have a lot to answer for. We're very arrogant, and unfortunately, as Petina said, there are far too many apologists in the white community for what happened. And they've almost been strengthened in their argument by what has happened in the last 15 years.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And David, we actually met for the first time 6 years ago, I think, at this festival. That's when I've met you for the first time. And I have to say, I read this book in manuscript, and I was so shaken, because you were not the person I recognized. So exactly as your I think it was Paul Tembanyati, right? Exactly as Paul Tembanyati reacted to your book, I reacted in the same way, like, who is David Coltart? I don't recognize this man. And there's one particular incident that I still can't get out of my head, which is an incident in Chirezi in 1977, when you saw a body being thrown down a mine shaft.
I participated.
You participated in throwing a body down a mine shaft. And I wonder what, I can imagine what that must have done to you. But I wonder why, afterwards, you didn't go to find that person.
For those, most of you obviously haven't read the book, all white Zimbabweans were conscripted during the war, and I was no exception. And in this particular incident, I was in the intelligence corps, and after contacts between Rhodesian forces and guerrillas, dead guerrillas were brought back to base camps, a bit like the Vietnam War. And because the Rhodesians didn't treat the war as a liberation struggle, but as acts of terrorism, each contact was treated as a crime.
Right.
And so we had to fingerprint and photograph dead guerrillas, and then we had to dispose of their bodies. And the practice was, horrifyingly, to throw, either to burn bodies or to throw them down mine shafts. And this was always done by subordinates. And I had to, on one occasion when I heard about this, I decided, although I was an officer, that I needed to go with the subordinates. And it's plagued me. My wife, we were in Bulawayo together last Sunday, and I recognized only some time after, when I got married, how I was suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome. I wasn't aware of it as a single person, but when I got married, for 7 years after we'd got married, I had nightmares. I would be waking up in the middle of the night and telling my wife to get under the bed. And tragically, I think a whole generation,
yeah.
on both sides have been afflicted by this. And if you want to understand Zimbabwe today, you have to understand that history, that all those war veterans, unlike Vietnam, are still in the country.
And they're running it.
And they're running it.
And they're untreated.
Yeah.
They're untreated.
But to get to the nub of your question, why have I not gone back? That is, a searingly difficult question to answer. And there are a variety of reasons for that. Funny enough, soon after getting back from university, I wanted to do that, and people said that I should not. I believe, not just in the context of the Liberation War, but certainly in the genocide which followed in the 1980s, that one of the reasons there is so much trauma in the country is because we have so much unfinished business.
Yeah.
We've got these bodies lying from the Liberation War and from the genocide of the 80s lying all over the country. And we've never closed that chapter, and quite frankly, I don't think that we'll have real peace until we do that. And so just one final word. What I say in the book is my hope is that by writing about it, and I find it incredibly difficult to write about. I mean, I was only 19 when that happened. But it plagues one your entire life. But we will only start to take the country forward when we start debating those things.
Do you know, sorry to take over from you, Sir Kieran, it just struck me that you go to every English village and every town and every city, and there's a public square somewhere where you have a war memorial to the glorious dead of the 2 world wars, right? You go to America, you've got Arlington National Cemetery, you've got memorials to the Vietnam dead. Zimbabwe, there isn't a single war memorial anywhere to any dead of any war, apart from the Second World War. That is the last time we put up public memorials. We do not commemorate the dead from the Independence War on either side. We do not commemorate the dead from the Gukurahundi genocide because obviously we can't afford to acknowledge it. And we do not acknowledge the dead from the recent 2008 election. So you're absolutely right, David, that until we face that ugly, ugly, horrible history of violence and death, we're never going to be a free people. And that's why I found it so difficult and uncomfortable to read your book. But I'm so grateful to you for writing it, because I think this is the first time that we're actually hearing an honest account from the other side. It wasn't just an adventure. It wasn't a boy's own adventure in the bush. It was a real thing, and real people lost their lives.
Just to internationalize this discussion, one of the things that terrifies me about the American election and Trump is that he's never experienced war. In fact, he's glib about it.
Yeah.
And the main reason I'm so committed to nonviolence now is because I've experienced war and the horrors of war, and I've seen how elderly politicians are so willing to send gullible young men to fight their own battles. And that, when I see Trump's comments recently, how glib he is about the Purple Heart, it terrifies me for the international community, because he doesn't understand what war is all about.
We needed a separate session on that, I suppose. There is more to say, I think, about... I think Africa actually is an extraordinary continent, because there is a considerably greater willingness to forgive, or at least to get on with life, than there is much nearer home. I dealt with Cyprus a lot, and the number of casualties in the 2 main convulsions in Cyprus is infinitesimal compared to what's happened in a number of African countries. But say in Rwanda, they still have to live together, and they do live together. And if you think that the day after the elections in Zimbabwe, Ian Smith was free to walk down the streets of Harare, and would probably be greeted by his black fellow citizens rather politely and even cordially, to think that Mugabe kept on Ken Flower, the head of the Central Intelligence Organization, to think that when Mnangagwa met the staff of the Central Intelligence Organization, him being Minister of National Security, he kept them all. He didn't fire them. There was a great degree of pragmatism. My problem when I lived there was that there was a lack of self-awareness with whites on issues like land. And I used to say to the commercial farmers, look, you own 4,000 families, own 1/4 of the entire country, and you own more than 90% of natural regions 2 and 3, which are the ones which are for commercial farming, the valuable land. It is not tenable long term for you to own 9/10 of the good farming land in Zimbabwe and 1/4 of the entire country. Plus, do you know that many of the people in positions of influence had their parents pushed off this land without any compensation at all? We were told when we went back in April, we have very good friends I used to play tennis with in Harare, and they told me that Joan and I were known either as the commies or the pinkos. They did say that they have had to change a lot since then, but there was a lot to change. By the way, in terms of colonialism, let's not forget, in my former role as a British civil servant, that Britain gave self-rule to Rhodesia in 1923. So they had 40 years to muck it up before UDI.
But it was self-rule that didn't include black people. It was self-rule for the white minority.
Yeah. And when Garfield Todd, as you record, when Garfield Todd tried to move to a more liberal dispensation, he got the push.
He got the chop,
so what do we do about this unfinished business? I mean, what is the correct form of truth-telling, setting the record straight, exposing what has been done by both sides, because some quite nasty things were done during the Chimurenga too. But some of them were done by whites pretending to be black guerrillas. How do you deal with it? I think you both said that the present government is not going to admit what they did in Gokurahundi, but until there is some accounting and some accountability, and some recompense, I suppose, even if it's only an apology, then this is going to simmer on, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I was going to say, before you even mentioned truth-telling, I was going to, take your hand and follow you down the path down which you want to lead us. And I'm so glad you mentioned Rwanda in your previous remarks, because even more terrible things happened in the Rwandan genocide than has happened in the last, God knows how many years of Zimbabwe. But the reason the Rwandese are able to live together side by side is because firstly they had an open process in which people talked about what happened in that process. Then that process was supported by the international community in the form of the International Tribunal for Rwanda. And then locally, the Gappah courts also operated to make sure that people saw justice operate at the local level. So there were these 3 processes that took place in Rwanda that meant that people were able to actually talk about what happened to them. I mean, therapy is absolutely important. And I see these truth and reconciliation commissions as a kind of therapy, a kind of letting go. There's there are 2 beautiful words in Shona that mean forgiveness. The first one is kuregerera, which literally means to let go. The second one is kukanganwira, which means to forget, right? So what we need is a process that will lead to kukanganwira on both sides. And I'm talking about kukanganwira from the war, from before the war. I'm talking about the Gokurahundi. I'm talking about the 2008 election and all the subsequent violence. There needs to be some kind of process where Zimbabweans are able to talk about what happened to them, even if it doesn't lead to actual prosecutions. We just need to be able to actually talk and say, this is what happened. This is the ugliness that entered our hearts. This is the ugliness that entered our communities. And that way we confront the ugliness of the past. Whether it will actually lead to any kind of legal prosecutions, I don't know. And I don't know that's the best possibility or outcome for Zimbabwe. But I think at the very least, there needs to be that, what you call the truth-telling.
David?
I share that. I think one of the great tragedies of Zimbabwe is that we have a culture of impunity, which is deeply embedded in our political system. And it goes way back to Lancaster House. Both Smith and Mugabe didn't want any truth-telling. There was a consensus, unlike de Klerk and Mandela, who agreed on a truth-telling. Both our leaders were adamant that they didn't want to do that. That was then compounded by the international community before you became High Commissioner, which looked the other way when the genocide happened. I think the international community was so focused on the Cold War and on encouraging white South Africans to embrace the end of apartheid that they covered up the genocide, which fostered that culture of impunity. And the only way really we can resolve all of this unfinished business is by going back to 1965. It's the date when Smith declared UDI. It would involve the whites so that the white community face up to their role in the militarization of society, in the violence which followed that. And then, of course, we've got to look at the genocide of the 1980s and also Mugabe, which we haven't touched on, the destruction of urban dwellings that arguably killed more people than both the war and the genocide because of the combination of poverty, the destruction of homes, and AIDS, of course. When we do that, and it's got to be victim-orientated, people have to be given an opportunity to say what happened to them. And then we can perhaps start healing the country.
We've only got 5 minutes, and so unfortunately we can't get into the aspect of this which is victor's justice. And that is always the danger, and you see around the world, starting in Nuremberg, I suppose, victor's justice is the norm. I'm told we have 5 minutes, so we will have one or two very, very fast questions. Madam, I think you were first with the pink cardigan.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I spent some time in Zimbabwe working occasionally, and I found it such a beautiful place. It was really sad when things went so wrong. But my question is, and I think you alluded to this, would the situation have been any different if Thatcher had followed through with the promise at Lancaster House of land recompense for the land?
Well, she did. I mean, this is the trouble with history. When I was High Commissioner, my first meeting with Mugabe, I said that we would make considerable extra funds available, but only on the basis of willing seller, willing buyer, and also that there was proper redevelopment. In other words, that the land went to those most in need. The actual land element of a proper redevelopment scheme is less than 1/3. Because you have to have training, you have to have equipment, you have to have infrastructure, and there was a doctrinal objection on the other side, which I personally understood, about going down the willing seller, willing buyer route, even though there was lots of land available. But then there was a catastrophic letter from Claire Short when Labour took over. Like me, she is of an Irish background, but she said that I don't feel any post-colonial guilt because I'm Irish and we had our land taken away and we got on with it, so you get on with it too. And again, it's a paradox, by the way, if I may talk about international relations, that left-wing governments in Africa very often get on better with right-wing governments in England, in Britain, than they do with left-wing. Relations between the South African government and the Labour government were much more difficult than with the Tory government. Now, two quick questions. Now, Mr. Muller, I suppose you have the droit de seigneur.
Oh, no.
I'll just answer that very quickly, if I may. I don't entirely agree with Sir Kieran's view on this because he was an insider as well. But I'll just say this. Land was a convenient grievance, sir. And no matter what would have happened, it is very likely that it would have continued to be a convenient grievance for ZANU-PF to get to where it is. But at the same time, on the other side, I always say to people who tell me here in this country, oh, African colonialism, it's all in the past. Your past is our present. So that land inequity is still felt today.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to ask a question about lack of Western support for the MDC and also the struggle for democracy. I was the chair of the Bar Human Rights Committee for many, many years, and David and I have worked together for the last 15, 16 years. And I may say, I think David, when I've worked
a quick question, please.
No, well, if I may, if I may, Kieran, because actually this is quite important. I've worked with many human rights lawyers around the world, I think David is one of the most honest, most compelling human rights lawyers that I have ever met in my life, and I would just want to say that. But secondly, it is incredibly difficult from being a human rights lawyer who have advocated for victims of human rights abuses to then move into government and sign a global political agreement. And David in 2009 did that and actually had to sit down, if you like, with his nemesis. And I remember in 2010 when you were here and we were dealing with a new coalition government, and you were turning around and saying the global political agreement is the only way forward at that stage. And you were beginning to put books into classrooms and everything else. And we took that 3-hour journey from here just over to Ayrshire to try and convince the Scottish Cricket Association to turn up to Zimbabwe just to give Mugabe a sense that the political agreement had dividends. And the Tory government, in the end, turned against you. So my question is this. I remember Blair turning around and prescribing virtually every organization that advocated violence to achieve political ends. Zimbabwe was the classic example of a non-violent movement, and yet actually was allowed to simply, wither on the vine. How much do you think that the West has a responsibility in relation to what happened in Zimbabwe in the subsequent elections?
I once did a debate on this topic at Intelligence Squared in London, and I had to argue that the West wasn't responsible, so I'm going to give that the other side to the debate now. No, I think that the international community shares a lot of responsibility. It's not only the international community. The fact is that UDI was a shocking mistake. The RF policies were indefensible. They radicalized black nationalists. They caused a war. They caused the militarization. You can't blame that on the West. And Mugabe committed a genocide. But where I do blame the West is that they didn't hold Mugabe accountable. Britain gave Mugabe a knighthood
Yep.
when they knew that he was responsible for a genocide. And that created in his mind a sense of impunity. And even in more recent times, when we had this option of a peaceful transition, the West, although it helped in some respects, didn't give it complete support. For example, sanctions were not lifted. When people like I was on Hard Talk on the BBC, you can't get a more public venue than that, calling for the lifting of sanctions. I've been a human rights lawyer for 3 decades, and the Conservative Party listened to a small clique of right-wing people in Britain, domestic opinion in Britain, and ignored what we were saying. And that, the non-lifting of sanctions allowed Mugabe not to fulfill other terms of the global political agreement, which in turn led to him being able to manipulate the election in 2013 and to retard the entire process. And we have burning in Harare again. So we are responsible as Zimbabweans, but the West does need to listen more to people on the ground.
The OAU could have done more, in my opinion. SADC could have done more. The only criticism I have of your book is or of MDC really, is the decision by Shangirai to withdraw from the second round of the presidential election, having won the first round. It seemed clear to me that if he had stayed on, he would have won, and he would have won handsomely. Now, in your book, you spell out the amount of violence that was going on, and that was intolerable. Therefore, he withdrew. If I'd been in his position, if I'd been in your position, I would have said, unless the African Union and SADC bring this under control, I will have to withdraw. And you would have had leverage, But as it was, withdrawing just left the field to
But it made that
Mugabe.
government illegitimate. It completely took away the legitimacy of that result. No one recognized that result. And it's what actually led to the unity government. And it's what led to David Coltart, over 5 years, putting books in classrooms. And we've said a lot of things about the wonderful work that David Coltart has done as a human rights advocate and as a lawyer. But I think his lasting impact will be what he did as Minister of Education, because you cannot replicate what he did. Those 5 years gave hope to the children of Zimbabwe, brought books to their classrooms, and none of that would have happened if Tsvangirai had not actually withdrawn from that election, leading to a unity government, leading to a bit of respite for the first time in more than a decade of crisis. So it's very easy, I think, to sit back and say, oh, I would have done this, I would have done that. But the reality is it was such a tough decision for him to make. I am by no means Tsvangirai's biggest fan. In fact, I can't stand the man, to be frank. But that's one of the few acts of bravery that he actually undertook. And for that, I think we really should be very grateful to not only Morgan Tsvangirai, but to David Coltart and all the members of the MDC who joined that unity government. And I was one of the people who said, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do this. I will admit publicly, David, I was wrong.
But that is an excellent note on which to end, unless you want to have the last word, David.
No, I think we're both MDCs, not just Morgan Tsvangirai's, our MDC, because I was in the smaller faction, where we're more culpable was not so much in 2008, but in 2013.
Exactly.
Where we were disunited and where the conditions for the election were so subverted that had we been more united and not feared that the other party would contest, we should have both withdrawn and left Mugabe to his own devices. We participated in this fraudulent process and handed the baton stick back to Mugabe and created this terrible situation that Zimbabwe finds itself in.
Surely you mean the button stick?
The button stick.
Sorry, can I just say one last thing? If there's any justice in the world, Leonardo DiCaprio, with his Rhodesian accent, will call David's agent, Judy, and say, we want to make a movie called The Struggle Continues, dude. Because I'm sure you saw DiCaprio in Blood Diamond with his very dodgy Rhodey accent. I think DiCaprio would make a very good David Coltart. So if any of you have any Hollywood contacts, please get him to call. But more importantly, please, please, please buy this book. David brought a gazillion copies from Bulawayo because he doesn't yet have a UK distributor, and we don't want him to take those copies back home. So please buy the book, and David will sign them.
That's a very good note on which to end. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.